In the future, Riri Williams arrives, unsure of how she got here. And everything sucks! Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and this is my review of Generations Ironman and Iron Heart #1. Okay, so this week's Patreon review winner was a bit of a doozy. I put it up on the poll deliberately knowing that this comic already generated quite a bit of negative reviews, and sure enough, it's what won, and I assume it won because of this reputation. People are gonna want to hear what I have to say about this comic. I went in with low expectations, but an open mind. After all, I've bucked the critical trend before. Maybe this comic is secretly good somehow, and people are just quibbling about something minor. Or maybe it's just a dumb comic that's fun. If it's entertaining, who cares if it's stupid? I've definitely taken that attitude before. This, all as it turns out, was not the case for Generations, and no amount of bad reviews could have prepared me for the nightmare that was going through this comic. Oh boy. This is a rare but not unheard of feeling when reading a bad comic, but it's worth dwelling on for a moment. Comics aren't terribly long, and this comic doesn't feel like it has a lot of actual story to it. So for it to just be such a miserable slog to get through, it speaks volumes about how bad it really is. There's a lot of bad comics out there that I hate, but I can get through no problem, so you have to achieve a special level of bad to become that difficult to read. The shame of it all is that, as terrible as this comic may be, I have to keep pulling myself back, ever so slightly. This isn't the worst comic in the world, not even close. There are some great panels and decent artwork throughout. A lot of different artists contributed to this comic, and some of their stuff really leaves an impression. I like the future the comic presents, or at least the idea of it. Things are looking up in the coming times of Marvel's world, for once. Life is good and not full of the typical dystopian drudgery we see in fiction these days. It's optimistic, and that really feels like a nice change of pace. It's also really cool to have a cameo from a grown-up Franklin Richards. However brief that cameo was, I didn't even think he was part of this universe. That was surprising, to say the least, and interesting in what it could mean, but they don't really dwell on it beyond the simple appearance of him. That's all well and good, but I have to say the future we see isn't all that original either. A lot of the Earth we do see is, this could make for a cool alien world or something, but it's very hard to believe that in less than 100 years, this is what the world will look like. I don't want to overplay this too much. There's a good idea in here that human civilization would indeed be so changed in several decades that it would be very difficult for us to recognize it. I just feel like this comic's interpretation of this is flawed in certain ways that are hard to put in words. Like, even giving someone an unlimited budget and the craziest engineering ideas in the world, it's hard to believe it would result in something that looks like this. It's hard to quantify that because it gets into this abstract notion in art. Does this image ring true? To me it doesn't, but that is something very subjective. I do recognize that. In fact, this whole thing I'm talking about isn't that big a deal. It bugged me, but that's really not the central problem of this comic. The real problem lies not in the future, but in the way Bendis wrote the future. It's a special level of bad that is hard to believe comes from a seasoned veteran like Brian Michael Bendis. I do like his work with characters like Miles Morales, the original Ultimate Spider-Man, and stuff like the New Avengers. But this comic is one of the worst things I've ever reviewed by the guy, and I've indulged in a lot of this man's work at this point. His worst habits of overly long, Joss Whedon-style snarky, quirky dialogue is on full display here, and holds the comic back so much, on every page and practically every panel. It's unbearable and why I found this comic so damn hard to read. I hate this comic's dialogue. The word cringe gets thrown a lot these days, but it is wholly appropriate here. Oh my god, you look terrible. I'm 126 years old. Then you look amazing. Dr. Stranger, get it because it's stranger that you're the Sorcerer Supreme than the guy that was named Dr. Strange was. You seem like you need an oil can. That was a thing, right? I can't believe we wrote that in. This is just a sample of some of the one-liners we get that I can present out of context, but everything about this comic is full of annoying dialogue like this. Potentially fun ideas like a future team of Avengers, or Tony Stark being the Sorcerer Supreme, are squandered. While there is no limit of time we can spend on Riri and Tony flying around talking about stupid, boring stuff. Exposition about the world, violating the show don't tell principle, and becoming so boring because of that. Snappy little lines that annoy more than help inform these characters, and if anything, make all the characters sound exactly the same and indistinguishable from each other. It's not just bad, it's shockingly bad. And honestly, I'm not avoiding this comic's plot too much. It's just that there isn't anything to it. Riri goes to the future, meets the Avengers, meets Tony, flies around a bit, almost gets into a fight with Morgan Le Fay, but then she just leaves. Then she goes back home, doesn't tell anyone about what happened, and builds a vague approximation of one of Tony's drones from the future. The ending is a nice little optimistic one, implying that Riri will be this amazing inventor famous across the galaxy. It's examples of preposterous wish fulfillment like this that really makes Riri Williams a bland character. She could be fun. She could have been a nice companion as Ironheart to the Iron Man family, kind of creating an Iron Man family actually, which I think would be a cool idea. But Marvel or Bendis or somebody had this weird idea of killing off the family just as her character was starting. The whole idea of this plucky little inventor that cobbled together her first Iron Man suit just because she could is the foundation for a potentially fun character, and one with some longevity in the narrative on the level of another Robin or Batgirl. It would be fun to have this group of iron-themed heroes. You got Tony and Rhodey, and then you could bring Pepper back as rescue, and then with Riri, you got a whole little team of these super-powered people with iron suits. I'd love that. But they can't do that. Rhodey's still dead, and Tony's only just coming back for Legacy next issue. Riri could have been a great part in carving out a little niche of the Marvel Universe just for Iron Man, giving them this sort of corner just like how Batman or Green Lantern or Spider-Man have their own in their respective universes. And I think that would be a great idea. Marvel just needs to tweak their formula and approach a little bit. If nothing else, this comic has me a little more optimistic for the rest of Iron Man and Legacy for this reason. For one thing, there's no way the rest of Legacy can be as bad as this comic, so that's a nice thought. And at the end of this comic, we get a preview of the next issue, which sums up a lot of parts of Legacy that gives me a bit of hope. First, Iron Man's returning, surprising nobody, but I think will really help in balancing things out with Riri's character. Maybe her return can flesh her out a bit more and not feel like a pale imitation of Tony and Rhodey kind of combined. But I also feel like Marvel is going back to its original numbering, and really seems to be trying to turn over a new leaf in some regards. Yes, it's all in the service of doing what DC did first, but we can't begrudge them for that forever. On the other hand, it's still Bendis at the helm of Iron Man, and this comic is not a good advertisement for that idea by any stretch of the imagination. The problem behind this comic isn't going away anytime soon, especially when we consider that as annoying as Riri's character kind of was in the comic, she doesn't really hold a candle to the way Tony was written. This comic was all about Iron Man and Ironheart, and I couldn't stand either of them. Like I said, Bendis' dialogue reads in a very samey way, while the two carry the bulk of that dialogue. So as you can imagine, the dialogue has a really big effect on these two characters. There's something very off about both of them. Riri being this galaxy-famous hero does feel like her being the most special, important person in the universe. Hence why I refer to her as being an example of wish fulfillment. But Tony is no better. In fact, I think he is the worst part in all of this. It feels like he's happy, and that's great and all, but doesn't feel like he's meaningfully changed with age whatsoever. He's still got that carefree personality. The only mode of Tony Stark that Bendis seems to know how to write. And it just feels wrong to me that the guy who runs away from all his problems, takes crazy stupid risks, constantly tanks his personal life, has no experience of personal growth or change, in all these years has experienced no evolution, no growth, no change, no consequences, nothing. He's not any wiser, he hasn't learned anything in however many years that has passed, and nothing has been meaningfully improved on in his life or dealt with. There's ways you could do it. He could either be wiser and have gotten past a lot of his baggage, or he could still be burdened by it. Neither feels very frustrating. Riri's the same way, lacking any depth, and held back from winning people over at a time when getting fans is paramount to his character's long-term staying power. But a character this dull isn't gonna stick in people's minds very well. That's what works about Miles. He ain't perfect. That's what works about the original Peter Parker, actually, is he's not perfect. Same thing with Tony Stark. But Riri's too perfect. Do not want to use the term that you're all thinking of, but it does kind of feel appropriate to her. I do like the idea of a new hero going on to be one of the greatest in the far future. There's a version of this that could be cool, where it says, like, look how big of a name you're gonna be one day. I don't know, I could see, like, a young Spider-Man go into the future and discovering he's a legend or something like that. That could work. Her discovery of this, in fact, should be a very cool and fun moment, but instead it just reeks of being old and false in a way that just makes this whole comic suck. One bad comic out of the Generations line doesn't mean all of Marvel Legacy is going to suck. However, it feels like a red flag in a series of red flags that I've been getting out of Marvel when it comes to what we know and have seen out of Legacy so far. I get the impression from this comic, the choice to not really shake things up behind the scenes, and stuff like making Loki the new Sorcerer Supreme, is signs that Marvel hasn't really learned any lessons and isn't planning on changing things in the future. Not in the way DC did with Rebirth, which was a genuine positive change for the better. This comic doesn't mean Legacy is doomed to fail, but I will say things aren't looking good. The best we can hope for is a step in the right direction. Where Rebirth was a great leap forward, Legacy seems like a pivot. At least Marvel's not going the wrong way anymore, but they still feel like they have a long way to go. I'm honestly a little shocked the company has let things get this bad. This was a really lousy comic for a flagship character's premiere issue in Marvel's big new relaunch. In this context, it's a little astounding how bad this is, that the company let something like this happen. If they hadn't have done a million soft reboots, this would be a really big deal, and actually should have had more time, effort, and thought put into it. Why the company isn't making more room for new talent, and clinging to mediocre staff for major titles and characters like Iron Man and Spider-Man is beyond me. But between Brian Michael Bendis and Dan Slott, so much valuable publication content goes to waste for their work. I just don't get it. There's room for both of these guys in Marvel, as both could certainly do well with a couple of titles, with Miles Morales or some other Spider-Man comic for Dan Slott. But front and center, these two have never really found their place. It hasn't been their forte. And comics like these confirm that to me every day. The management of this company's comic line baffles me with moves like this. I'll leave it to your imaginations as to whether or not you think I recommend this comic. See if you can figure that out. Thanks for watching this video, and let me know your thoughts on Generations so far. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.